There are more than 70 million refugees in the world, according to the United Nations' latest report. Fleeing war, famine, persecution, and natural disaster, refugees travel thousands of miles for safety and security. The global refugee protection tasks are even tougher the past few years. What's behind the EU migration crisis? Will EU leaders solve the problem shoulder to shoulder? And what about the long-lasting Syrian refugee settlement? Will China's Belt and Road Initiative help alleviate the global refugee flow? To discuss these issues and more, I'm very much honored to be joined by Mr. Filippo Grandi, UN High Commissioner for Refugees. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to our dialogue. Mr. Filippo Grandi, you are the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. The question, obviously, is what does the big number of up to 70 million refugees that the world has mean for the future and for all governments?
It means that we have become not very good at making peace and building peace, because refugees, these 70 million refugees, displaced people, they are the people who escape, who flee from war, from violence, from persecution, from discrimination, and other forms of abuse against certain people. That's what happens. But most of them, the largest number, flee from war. And the fact that this number is growing every year for the past 5, maybe 10 years, this number has grown.
Despite the end of the Second World War, the end of the Cold War?
Absolutely, means that the mechanism that we have to address war are not functioning very well.
Does the number of 70 million include children or descendants of the first generation of refugees?
In some cases, unfortunately, yes. And what does this mean? This means that they are the situations which caused the flight of their fathers or grandfathers and grandmothers is still there. We have many Afghans, for example, Afghan refugees in Pakistan and Iran that are third-generation refugees. This year we are observing the 40th anniversary, 40th anniversary of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which caused the exodus of millions of Afghans. Many went back, but not all. And there are many other situations in Africa, like the Somali refugees, that are similar. And this is even more worrying than what I said before, because protracted conflict, long crises are more difficult to address than new ones.
You are one small step short of mentioning the Middle East Arab-Israeli conflict that led to millions fleeing their homes, like Palestinians, but they cannot go back to their homeland for obvious reasons. The Israeli authorities had a different argument about the issue of refugees. What do you make of their future?
Well, the Palestinian refugees are a very complex case, because the resolution of the Palestinian refugee issue can only be achieved if other aspects of the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians are also addressed.
For example, the future of Jerusalem.
The future of Jerusalem, the future of borders, the security of both people, the use of natural resources, especially water, and therefore it has become one of the most complex issues. But there you have a conflict that has been going on for more than 7 decades.
So the solution is well beyond the capacity of your commission.
Actually, the Palestinian refugees in the Middle East are taken care of by a separate organization, of which also I was responsible before, UNRWA. So they are dealing with this very complicated problem, and it is very challenging for them. But in the Middle East, my organization, often in the same countries like Jordan, like Lebanon, deals with another huge phenomenon, although it is more recent, which is that of Syrian refugees. 5.5 million Syrian refugees in the countries surrounding Syria.
What about the difficulties of the Turkish government, which hosts up to 4 million? Perhaps Turkey is the country that hosts the biggest number of refugees. Can this government in Ankara afford to sustain the accommodation for daily care for the refugees? Such a big number. I mean, it's a huge drag on their economy.
You're quite right that Turkey is the largest single refugee hosting country, as we call them, in the world. Almost 4 million Syrians and other refugees. They have Iraqi refugees, Afghan refugees, but the bulk is Syrian refugees. It's a huge drain on their resources. Turkey has spent a lot of its own resources to help these people. There has been also international assistance. But what we are telling our donor countries is that although now we are entering, I think, the 9th year of the war in Syria, we should not let down the support that is provided to countries like Turkey. And Lebanon and Jordan are the other countries that are severely affected. You know, in Lebanon, 1 person in 4 people is a refugee between Syrian and Palestinian. It's unbelievable. It's like in China, hundreds of millions were refugees. That's the proportion. And Lebanon is a very small country with even less resources than Turkey, so needs a lot of support.
Up to 55% of worldwide refugees came from 3 countries, Syria, Afghanistan, and South Sudan. What's the severity of the situation in South Sudan years after its independence?
South Sudan is a very worrying case. It's a country that emerged 6, 7 years, 8 years ago from a very severe civil war between this part of the country and the rest of Sudan, got independence, and shortly after independence, when refugees had returned already, millions of them, to South Sudan, another conflict erupted between different groups inside South Sudan. And again, people had to flee. 1/3 of the population of South Sudan is either displaced internally or refugee outside. 4 million over 12. Now, there's been some talks in recent months that are promising. So I hope that the international community really will provide support, political support to these talks, so that stability can be restored, people can go back, development can resume. The conflict that is now prevailing within South Sudan has very strong ethnic components, different ethnic groups within South Sudan itself. But there are a lot of resource issues, because South Sudan, and this is the paradox, a country that is plagued by conflict, poverty, misery of people, is actually a very wealthy country with a lot of resources that are themselves the object of contention and of war.
But there is also the issue of resource curse for a country that is subject to fluctuations in oil prices. Having said this, what's the budget for the year 2019, and where does the fund come from?
UNHCR has a budget that is roughly, year on year, $8 billion. $8 billion. And we receive contributions from governments. They are voluntary. Nobody is obliged to contribute, and the amount that is contributed is also a choice of each government. We receive about 50 to 60% of what we need. So every year we have to prioritize, and we cannot do certain things that we would like to do. Increasingly, we are receiving funding from the general public through fundraising campaigns or the private sector. This level was very low before. Now it has reached about 10%, about $500 million every year. As a matter of fact, this is why I'm here in Boao, to talk to the Chinese private sector about the importance of also participating in this humanitarian effort.
Have you ever talked to the richest people in, for example, North America, like Bill Gates and founding chairman of Facebook, so on and so forth?
We have a good cooperation with the Gates Foundation in many areas, especially health, which is one of their areas of focus. And we cooperate with a number of other big corporations, Google, for example. And Facebook has allowed us to use their media, facilitated that to create awareness about our program. So cooperation with the private sector does not need to be only donations, can be partnership in many other ways.
Back to the issue of refugees in Syria, the United States says troops will be withdrawn from the war-torn country. However, different voices came up very quickly saying, no, 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 many Americans would remain there. There is not only the issue of how to reconstruct this country, but also 2.6 million children have been forced to flee their homes and are still living inside Syria. President Erdogan says a security zone should be created to accommodate refugees who are left either internally or stateless, meaning refugees should come back from neighboring countries of Syria. What do you think of his proposal?
I think, and that's what I've been telling leaders in the region and beyond, that you need to make all of Syria secure for people to go back, or as much as possible. Safe zones are an interesting proposal, always in situations of war and exodus. But how safe are they? Who will guarantee that safety? See, this is what is important. The rest is politics, and it's not my mandate. But for me, it is important, one thing is important. If people are refugees or displaced, and we want them to go back to their homes, we must make sure that that return is safe and secure, and that that safety is sustainable, not just for 1 month or 2 months, but in the long run. Now, I was in Syria just a few days ago, and I have seen areas in which stability is increasing. The way the conflict is evolving means that more area of the country are now stable. People that were refugees inside the country, we call them displaced people, are returning in large numbers. People that are outside the country are returning in smaller numbers for now. But if that kind of security increases and people think that that security will remain, I am sure that more people will return.
Without security assurance, how can children in the number of 2.6 get opportunities for education, medical care, and particularly those children must have been traumatized mentally, psychologically? What should be done to let children feel now they are safe, they are back in their homeland?
Well, I think that you hit the nail on the head. What needs to be done first and foremost is achieving peace. And peace is very complicated in Syria after 8 years of very violent conflict, which has not only destroyed a lot of infrastructure, entire parts of big cities have been razed to the ground, but has also destroyed the fabric of society. So to reconstruct that will take time. But you have to understand how returns occur. Sometimes when you have a large situation like the Syria exodus, not everybody comes back at the same time. People will have different considerations, different preoccupations. They come from different parts of the country, more or less destroyed, more or less affected. So most likely we will witness a gradual return. We should not be impatient. Nobody should be pushed back. And I have to say that none of the neighboring countries is pushing people to go back, because return has to be voluntary. Otherwise it will not be right or sustainable. But it will be, in my opinion, quite gradual. But for those people who go back, they need support. And this is a very important message that I always pass to our donors, to the international community.
Do we have any international laws that prevent host countries from repatriating or sending refugees back to their homeland against their will?
Well, there is a fundamental principle that is generally accepted, although there are exceptions, that return has to be, we call it in 3 ways. Voluntary, so people have to accept, to choose to go back, safe, in security, and dignified. You know, it is not good that people go back and live in misery and have no, as you said, no education, no health, no water, that would not be dignified, and that would not be sustainable. People would move again very quickly, so it's not worth making the effort to help them return. So voluntary, safe, and dignified. This is our advice on how return should be. These are the fundamental principles that states usually agree with.
Thank you so much. You are watching Dialogue with Mr. Filippo Grandi, High Commissioner for Refugees under the United Nations. We'll be back in a short while. Stay with us, please. Welcome back. Now, how difficult is it to identify and clarify the status of refugees? Because some of them, or perhaps many of them, are economic asylum seekers, like in the case that took place in many of the European Union countries. So what do you think of the challenges that politicians in the EU face?
It's a big challenge because, as you said, people are now moving together. Refugees that are escaping from conflict, from war, but also people that are seeking better economic opportunities. Very often in today's world, all these people utilize smuggling, trafficking networks to be able to move. And when states receive them, they have to make decisions. We advise that it is important to make a distinction, because if you send back to their homes somebody who is a refugee, this person risks his or her life. Migrants have other rights, of course. They are human beings, they have human rights, but their situation is different. And what is important in the case of migration is to create legal migration channels so that people can get visas and can avail themselves of job opportunities in countries that actually, like in Europe, need migration for their economy. So these are two distinct categories. And to go to your initial question, is it possible to make a distinction, to make a determination, as we call it, of refugee status? Yes, it is possible. We have guidelines. Sometimes it is states that make this determination, and we act, if they want, as an advisor to them. Sometimes some states delegate this function to UNHCR, so we do it on their behalf and with their agreement. It is possible. It is quite a complex process, but it is being done every day in many parts of the world.
Chancellor Angela Merkel came under fire from those disgruntled Germans, or even member states of the European Union, for accepting such a big number of refugees and asylum seekers a couple of years back. But of course she was honored Mother of the Year by Time magazine. That said, how difficult is it to let those refugees and asylum seekers get integrated into or with the local mainstream society, such as education, Medicare, let them have the skills so that they can find jobs?
Let me say two words about Chancellor Merkel, because I think this is a very important issue that you raised. Let's not forget that when she said that people were welcome, at that time in 2015, most of the people arriving in Germany were people from Syria, escaping a conflict that at that time was at its peak, very violent. So she made a very important humanitarian gesture. She somehow defended the European values of solidarity and protecting people that needed international help. What failed her was cooperation between European countries. She and Sweden, and at that time Austria, were left very much alone, bearing this responsibility. If there had been, from the beginning, sharing of all of Europe in an equitable way, as we suggested, as the European institutions suggested, I think the problem would have been manageable with much less negative consequences than we have seen later. And the other issue that you are raising is an important one: integration. Actually, in countries like Germany, integration programs are quite good. They're expensive, which is a big challenge, but they're good. But not everywhere this type of activity is carried out with the right resources. And when you don't have integration, you create a marginalized community that risks being very destabilizing for society. So our advice to governments is invest in integration of refugees. Although the political climate is not very conducive, I think this is a good investment for the future.
Out of humanitarian reasons and for the sake of protecting European solidarity of the European Union, of course, Chancellor Angela Merkel deserves credit for accepting up to 1 million refugees in Germany alone. But regarding the issue of integration, what do you think of the religious conflicts? For example, politicians in Central and Eastern European countries, most of them said they would reject accepting any refugees because they are the Orthodox, they find religious questions incompatible. So they block the border against the consensus of the European Union, which is, of course, a fundamental principle upon which the European Union and the enlargement as such has been made possible. Do you think the European Union has been divided over the issue of refugees?
Yes, I think that to invoke the Christian character of Europe as a reason for not accepting refugees or even migrants from other cultures, other religions, and here I speak as a European, not as a High Commissioner for Refugees, I think that is wrong. I think that if we talk about European values, the nature of Europe is to be open to diversity. And especially when it comes to helping people that are in distress, in danger, we should not look at what religion they're from or what culture they're from, what language they speak. We should share and protect them to the extent that we can. So I think that that position I disagree with very strongly. I agree with the European institutions in this sense, not with those countries that are implementing different policies.
What do you make of the huge negative impact of the far-right movement and the rising populism, which is an important hallmark of what is called deglobalization? President Trump says a wall has to be erected along the border, and many right-wing leaders in Europe say they don't accept the refugees, or even the idea of a free flow of human resources between and among member states of the European Union. I mean, that's why Brexit is likely to take place.
Yeah. You know, I think that globalization, as we know, as we celebrate here at the Boao Forum, has brought enormous benefits to the world in terms of shared prosperity, connectivity, and other countless advantages. I think that in living through this globalization over the decades, we have overlooked the fact that not everybody benefited from it. And we have discovered in the last few years that there are very big parts of society, including in very rich countries like in America, in Europe, that have been excluded from this globalization and are angry and are now pushing back against some of the features of this globalization, including the movement of people. So I think that we have all been blind to this gap. Now we need to address it, because through this gap many fears, many apprehensions have come across. Fear of losing jobs, fear of insecurity, fear of one's values being threatened. These are very serious fears. But I do not think that to link these fears with the arrival of refugees that need protection, that are afraid themselves, is the right thing to do. And I am upset, I am angry with those politicians in Europe and in other parts of the world that have, in my opinion, manipulated these fears, put the blame on refugees and migrants, and through this gained consensus for electoral purposes. I think this does not solve the problem of that disenfranchised minority or disenfranchised groups, does not solve their problems, does not help people in need of protection gain that protection. It only helps those politicians get elected. That, I think, is a very bad political development, which I hope we will be able to overcome.
The massacre that took place in Christchurch, New Zealand, I'm afraid is not the first, though in terms of scale it is. It will not be the last in terms of white supremacy and the rise of racial extremism or Islamic, religious extremism. So what do you think of the consequences arising from lone wolf like Charlie Hebdo satirical publication in France and bloody massacre of people in a theater in Paris? So these things make Europeans and the whites think twice about not only the concern of white supremacy, but also, for example, whether ISIL soldiers could benefit from the asylum-seeking waves and use that as a camouflage so that one day they could emerge as terrorists.
You see, I think that there are many different aspects to these problems that you have outlined, which are very serious problems. I think that when you start using discriminatory language, you can start migrants and refugees, then you have anti-Semitism or Islamophobia, anti-Islam. You have many phenomena that you see in the modern world. They may seem small. Some people say these are just a few crazy people using that language. And yet we see that that type of language, which unfortunately some politicians are either using or condoning or protecting, we see that that language can kill, and can kill in large numbers, and can become a terroristic phenomenon in itself.
The last question, Philippa, is very much about the use of social media. The government in New Zealand has outlawed those who release video clips about the shooting in Christchurch. That gives rise to a question about the spread of hate speeches. You work for a refugee organization of the United Nations, but what are your suggestions for stemming the flow of such hate speeches?
Well, there are many things that need to be done. By the way, I think that the response of the people of New Zealand, led by their Prime Minister, was exemplary. Their response was measured, was aimed at conciliation and reconciliation, was a full recognition that refugees and migrants are welcome, that all minorities are respected. So it was a very positive example. We tend to look today at the negatives, at the hate speech, and it is correct. We should be worried about that. But let's look also at where the positive prevails, and that was the New Zealand reaction. In terms of what needs to be done, there are many things that need to be done. And certainly social media organizations had a duty to become more vigilant about how these means are used in terms of spreading very dangerous ideologies and positions. And I think that they have the means to do it. We know that these are very powerful organizations with a lot of resources, and I'm glad that some of them are now looking at this particular phenomenon.
I do appreciate your views and insightful analysis about the roots of refugee problems and perhaps the driving force behind the rise of populism as well as terrorist attacks, extremism as well. But the issue, by the end of the day, I'm afraid, is whether censorship should be imposed on those who abuse their rights of free speech in a democracy. We keep this discussion open next time for Philippa Grandi to come over and join our brainstorming. Until next time, goodbye.